Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for the Western Connecticut UFO Conference. So we have another presenter this evening. His name is Peter Robbins. Peter is an investigative writer, author, and lecturer whose writing and research are focused on the subject of anomalous UFOs and their implications for humanity. He's appeared as a guest on and been a consultant to numerous radio, television programs, radio shows, and documentaries. He's also the host of a rodeo program as well that he will probably plug. So, Peter, thank you for joining us this evening as part of the Western Connecticut UFO Conference.
Well, I'm glad to, Aurelio, and thank you for your hard work and dedication in making this conference a reality every year. Wouldn't it be amazing if half, a quarter, a tenth of the public libraries around the country had this dedication and this kind of idea? You asked me to speak about the UFO abduction phenomena, and we'll go and get as much as we can in about it, but consider it the most cursory sort of introduction. 45 odd minutes with 15 minutes for questions. After more than 40 years of study in this particular area, I am at a point where I long ago realized how little I am sure that I know about the sweep and the breadth and the motivations behind this phenomena. It falls into that category in human activity for many folks, even the most open-minded of us. In, I guess, the mantra to apply is it can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it must be something else. And it's natural to struggle or to postulate that, because it's a lot easier to deal with than the reality that this is really happening. That regularly individuals from every kind of background in every part of the world are dealing with the basic reality of waking up with, in many cases, a glow in the room, beings usually associated with the gray archetype, and that they are taken, and in the process of being taken, floated through brick walls, ceilings, plate glass, defying every law of physics that we know and every law of gravity, and end up quite often in what we can only assume is a craft, are examined, subject to procedures, and overwhelmingly returned from whence they came. I, in my investigations on my own, but probably more significantly for many, in the many years that I worked as the assistant to a man named Bud Hopkins, who most folks who are familiar with the work understand was really the pioneer investigator into the scientific study of this particular area of UFO-associated research. Bud's credentials were to be highly intelligent, to be incredibly curious, and to be faced with a mystery that he became, fair to say, somewhat obsessed about trying to learn everything he could and share that knowledge with readers and listeners and people who heard him speak or, saw him on radio and television and moving on like that. Bud was a painter, a professional painter. He was a graduate of Oberlin College, had a BFA in fine arts, and was the best damn self-trained investigator I ever met in my life. I used to joke with him sometimes that had he gone into the world of law enforcement, God help the criminal element in New York City. I'm proud to say that my credentials are about the same. I have a BFA in fine arts. I started my professional life as a painter. Unlike Bud, though, who never stopped painting, the period of years that I was obsessed with it before it leveled out and it was something that I had rather than it having me. I'm fairly proud of my background as a self-trained investigator. What are some of the basics that we can assign to this subject? Well, the late, great Dr. John Mack, a name that some of you are certainly aware of. John wrote a number of books, and two of them dealing with the abduction phenomena and the unknown. He was a highly distinguished psychiatrist associated with Harvard University. He was the co-founder of the psychiatric wing of Cambridge Hospital in Boston. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for a psychiatric biography of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. And he was also a good friend and somebody who I was proud to have as a colleague. John, in order to establish a certain beachhead, so to say, in this subject, did something that none of the rest of us in the work of any significance were credentialed to do, and it would have been very inappropriate. He administered a battery of standard psychological tests to the people that he worked with over the years who claimed to have these kind of events happen in their life. And for some of us, not surprisingly, statistically, people who had come forward to him statistically had the exact same ratio of neuroses, pathologies, addictions, obsessions that anybody in the non-UFO related sector had. Absolutely identical. And that was important. Why is this going on? Well, there's one of the huge questions. Again, I base my knowledge, or the closest thing I have to it, to personally interfacing with some hundreds of people over the decades, many of them through Bud, but certainly hardly all, who are convinced that these things are happening. You do this work, and one of the dangers is having your points of view and your research governed by being a believer. The more evidence that's presented in any individual case, and it's very often not just anecdotal. Physical evidences as solid as those that you could bring into a court of law often accompany accounts, multiple witnesses, photographic evidence, histories of the same kind of events in the area, physiological changes to organic material associated with your events. And one of the most poignant aspects is a history within the family when it is allowed to be explored. I've dealt with, as a number of my colleagues have on occasion, 3 generations of people in the same family. That when the field of research kind of was in its infancy, and I'd put that in the mid-later 70s, it had never really been actively explored. I think the reason for that is very human. Back at that time, the core of UFO researchers, primarily middle-aged white guys, which I think is still, pretty solid, although it's more varied now. A main concern was being taken seriously it was considered acceptable and right to talk about lights in the night sky, radar returns, pilot sightings, what we call trace cases, where again there's a physiological change to maybe the soil where a truly anomalous UFO touched down. But as David Jacobs, another pioneer in the work, had once remarked to me, and David has a very wonderfully dark sense of humor, we were focused on the cars and not the drivers. To cross that line and start to talk about aliens or beings that were responsible for this, well, then you're into the flying saucer and little green men, yuck, 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 wink, wink, nudge, nudge territory. So it was avoided. Hopkins was the one who quietly started to research this in the, again, starting in the mid 70s, and first published in 1981. The book that he published, and it's still seminally important, is Missing Time, which not only is a phenomena often associated with people's experiences who have been taken, but added a new phrase to the English language. Even folks who are not necessarily interested in this work, popular culture has made that term associated with this subject, the same way that the word gray, when used in a certain context, is understood not to be a shade between black and white. Language changes as we move forward. Anyway, that book really was a game changer. Hopkins followed it in 1987 with Intruders, which is still, again, a very important case revolving around the experiences of a woman named Deb White Cabell, her real name. She still lives in Kokomo, Indiana, where these things happened to her growing up, and has written a wonderful book of her own, the name of which unfortunately escaped me at the moment, but one of the better of the abductee or witness accounts that we have. Deb's mom is very open also about her experiences. And I remember when I first met her, gosh, 1984 or so, her showing me a scoop mark scar, another bit of physical evidence that we see repeatedly on a certain part of her lower leg, and then a photograph of her mother's lower leg with the same scar in the same place. I became involved in this work not out of intellectual curiosity. In fact, I had never given the subject much thought, UFOs in general, and certainly this, until a bit over 40 years ago when my late sister Helen told me about her very conscious abduction memories. That conversation came up when a repressed memory, or the repressed memory of childhood. I do joke with people sometimes that if I have other repressed memories, I don't remember them. But a memory of a profoundly unambiguous UFO sighting that we had together as kids over the area that we grew up in Long Island, New York. And it so shocked me and so destabilized my thinking. I had to find a therapist. It was a very different time, and I felt so disassociated from society as a result. I was very fortunate to find Dr. Baker, Ellsworth F. Baker, who had had 2 sightings of his own, and was able to help me understand that I wasn't crazy, nor was my sister, nor were we hallucinating. The world was crazy in that it simply was unable to accept this paradigm shifting idea. I'll give you some examples from my life, and this is, again, sort of a freewheeling talk here. When I was 20 years old and an art student at the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut, before I transferred to the School of Visual Arts in New York, where I ended up teaching for many years and where I got my degree, as one does, it's a classic part of art education. You work from figure models. And I'm a young guy, 20 years old, and I go to class, and the model for the next few weeks is a beautiful young woman. And you work from, the nude. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. Whether it was love or lust, I don't remember, but we became quite close. And she was some years older than me. And we started spending quite a bit of time together. And when she got to know me better, she said, I want to tell you something. And she told me that when she was living in California, I think it was near the Presidio Park in San Francisco, she had been in a wooded area and came upon a landed craft and was taken. And I remember my reaction as well as I can. I didn't want to do anything to destabilize this wonderful romantic relationship, but it must have immediately showed on my face that, I love you, I want you, but this is crazy. And she just burst into tears and said, you don't believe me either. Um, Years ago, when I worked for a multimedia company in New York City, one of my colleagues, who still is a good friend, said, let's go out for a drink tonight. He had never asked me anything like that before. And over a couple of drinks, he confided to me that he had had these experiences his whole life, along with his brother, that although he never talked about it, and he started rattling off all the books that he had read. He was very knowledgeable, watched all the documentaries. It was truly his secret life. And he had never even told his wife. And he felt he could confide in me, as people do. And, those are confidences you keep. 2 or 3 days later, he came up to me late afternoon and said, let's go for a drink again. I thought, okay. And over that second drink, it was to the effect of, listen, I feel so silly. The fact is I watch a lot of science fiction movies. I'm smoking some weed, and I read a lot of science fiction novels. And I immediately got what was happening and said, I again feel really foolish, but I think it was just imagination. It wasn't, but he must have been almost horrified that he had shared this thing, heard himself say it to another person, and then kind of redacted it. About 10 years ago, I was giving a talk in Buffalo, New York, and I was introduced to an experiencer who salted the earth, and I saw him several months ago again and verified the story with him. A lifelong abductee. Bill is an electrician. He's married to a registered nurse. They live out in the countryside in a big old house with the most sensible interior you could imagine. Everything, very workmanlike and very just so. But I noticed it's a very open sort of floor plan. If I did a 360-degree turn, I would see no less than a dozen clocks. And they were not clock collectors, but there was an obsession with time and the passage of it. And the sponsor, who was a local MUFON representative, said, Bill said he'd like to tell you this one story, and it's one I've never forgotten. He was asleep. The scenario was the same as it happens with most couples. The interest is in one of them. It can be a married couple, romantically involved, a brother, sister, what have you. But it begins. He happened to be sleeping on his stomach at the time, usually on his back. And he woke up as he was starting to rise. His wife is absolutely out cold, doesn't even bother to try to call her because she's not going to wake up. And he knows what's going to happen. He's going to go through the roof, through the ceiling and through the roof and be taken, and then sometime later be brought back. Something went wrong. As he's rising, and at this point, let's say a quarter of an inch or so, there his molecules are in the plaster of the ceiling, and had things continued, he would have gone straight through. But something happened, and they're not perfect, and neither is their technology. But gravity took over, and he came crashing down. Of course, his wife woke up immediately, and the problem was that because part of his flesh was already in the ceiling, it pulled out a part of the ceiling and gave him a nasty wound. And it's the middle of the night. His wife is a nurse, and she patched him up. The thought of, I mean, it was thankfully it was no worse than that. Can you imagine going to the ER and explaining an injury like that? Why is this happening? What is their interest in us and this phenomena? It's something that people in the work have debated since it's been a subject of discussion. If you meet somebody who says they absolutely know the reason, um, maybe they do, but I sure don't. And the more sure that certain individuals are, with highly specific claims of where they come from, what they eat for breakfast, how far it is to their home galaxy, etc., I tend to step back and nod and smile a bit, but I'm really clear that this knowledge is nothing that I share, and that perhaps their beliefs are affecting what they put forward as empirical fact. Bud used to joke sometimes the parable about the six blind men and the elephant, that if the UFO abduction phenomena is an elephant and there are six researchers discussing what the nature of the phenomena is, the argument is never resolved because one of them is discussing from the point of view of holding the trunk, the other the tail, the other a tusk, the other's got his arms around a leg, the other's patting the side of the elephant. You get the picture. We're feeling our way in the dark here. There's no established, absolutely certain body of data. But statistically, I think I can say, even though there is no data bank that absolutely registers this, in a scientific matter, when we first started looking into it, we collectively in the UFO research community in the 70s, I think it was logical to assume that it was right up there with getting hit by a bolt of lightning. If it ever happened to you, it was a random crazy thing that happened once, and the claim that it happened more than once could actually, or more than twice, could actually make the witness more problematic in the idea of the pragmatic researcher, because it just didn't make sense. What we now know, as well as we can know, is that if it is happening to you, it has probably happened repeatedly since early childhood, and that it happened to at least one of your parents, and that there is a likelihood that it may affect the lives of at least one of your children. Chilling stuff, but true. And there are events that do seem more random. I have come to feel very strongly that unless you've been living under a rock, or you live in a tiny village in a remote part of the world, every one of us knows someone that this has absolutely happened to. And the more friends and acquaintances and folks that now, of course, virtually, the likelihood is that you know considerably more than one person this has happened to. Perhaps you know that you that person has had this experience as well as one can know because they've shared it with you, although the likelihood is at least just as good that this is not something that they share. And that would mean in this country alone, there are some millions of people who have been affected by this. Again, the why. I can only give you my thoughts on it, but they're rooted in very human understanding. The legendary anthropologist Margaret Mead, who for many years headed the anthropology department at the wonderful Museum of Natural History in New York, thankfully was asked about the reality of UFOs specifically, not the abduction question. It didn't come up in her lifetime. And this would have been in the 1960s, and what she thought of it. Her response was to the effect that I'm not an alien and I don't know what they think. However, as an anthropologist, if I'm, with a hypothetical team of researchers and we're somewhere deep in the Amazon jungle in an area not only that no Westerners have ever penetrated, but no flight routes have ever been over, and we part the bushes and we look down into the valley, and here's this Stone Age or pre-Stone Age tribe living their life as they have for 50, 100,000 years. Well, we are going to study them. We are going to take notes. We are going to write books and make our correlations until we discover oil or gold, and then all bets are off and in we go. I think it's fair to say that the abduction phenomenon is not something new and modern, and that has been going on possibly since time immemorial. And that brings up another subject that's rather uncomfortable to some folks, which is what is the impact that these other intelligences, specifically those behind the gray beings phenomena. I don't think any of us assume that the grays reproduce in the rather simple, conventional mammalian way that Mr. and Mrs. Gray or two grays meet each other at a social event. They're attracted to each other. They start to date. They get together. They have the equivalent of sex, and baby gray is born. Most of us have come to feel these are laboratory manufactured beings. Who is behind them is the question. And what segment of the world of visitors from however many civilizations does that represent? I heard a stat just this week, I think it was on NPR, and it was just a passing remark, and I want to see if I can validate it, but it was there are more than 100 billion star systems in our galaxy, and there are more than 100 billion galaxies in our, whatever the word is next. Every one of those stars has the potential, if it's about the size of our sun, of having a planet about the size of our Earth, about the same distance as the Earth is from the sun, to the same, depending on your point of view, whether or not you are a pragmatist and an agnostic or a person of faith that sees all this as driven with the spiritual base, that you've got millions and millions and millions of possibilities of either the same chemistry and basic elements to create that primordial stew that produces that first one-celled animal that splits in half and we're off and running, or that God created it. For those who feel that we're alone in the universe, I laugh in your face. I mean, mathematically, I think even the most entrenched conservative astronomers and space scientists, even if begrudgingly, admit there's lots of possibilities out there that this could be going on all over the place. The argument often comes down to the old one that Stanton Friedman used to regularly make mincemeat of. They can't get there from here. Well, that's based on the arrogant assumption that we have some understanding of the motor forces that they're dealing with. It's very poignant to look at some of the authentic declassified documents back generated in the later 1940s, where the speculation was based on the most advanced thinking of the greatest technical minds based on where we had proceeded to, that you can only go so fast and there are only so many means of propulsion. And we based, our assumptions on that. It's not out of the question, although it would have been heretical, I think, some years ago to even postulate it, that they, like we do now routinely, have a particular interest in this group of species we call humanity. And that in the same manner that we routinely do gene splicing or muck around with the basic DNA of animals here on Earth, certainly plants, that they've been doing that with us since time immemorial, that we are, in fact, in part or in great part, in our current form, the result of genetic manipulation. Well, why are they doing that? Certainly, it's not for entertainment purposes. And then we get back into ideas generated by ancient astronaut thinking. That concept, of course, in popular culture, introduced in the 1960s by the Swiss-German journalist Erich von Däniken, and picked up by a number of ranking scholars since then, one being Zecharia Sitchin, John Anthony West. There's a slew of them now. But the idea of another civilization coming here, in part because gold is important to their technology. Forget about gold in terms of jewelry. It is the ultimate conductor, and that this planet had gold on it. And why not create a more advanced race capable of mining, and put yourself forward as a god? In other words, literally create religion as a driving force to motivate people to produce. Simply one theory. Or that the abduction phenomena may be driven by a way of monitoring the changes in human tissue, in the toxicology of our increasingly polluted planet, with the aim of trying to produce a being that has the best chance of surviving as we move into the future. And that's nothing to joke about. That part of the abduction phenomena, where it gets particularly disturbing for me, and I remember when it was first introduced in my thinking decades ago, and I had a real problem with it, which is the idea of hybrids, beings that are part us and part them. Missing pregnancies, where fetuses in late term simply go missing. They're not spontaneously lost in an accident or aborted. They're there one day and they're gone the next. We have a very disturbing history of this. The implants, which is something that, again, human beings have now become very good at manufacturing, that often accompanies individual accounts of people who have these experiences, a small object, sometimes no larger than a BB or a grain of rice, silicone or metallic based, that's introduced into the body, often subcutaneously, but never with any scarification, and occasionally in places where it just can't be logically. I've seen several CAT scans of these things inside a human brain, an inch or two in. There it is, and no history of any surgery or anything like that. My sister and quite a number of individuals I've met, spent time with, who have had these things removed at their own request, had them, or in Helen's case, in a sneezing fit. She had very bad hay fever and asthma, blowing it out your nose, inserted well up in the nasal cavity. So many more questions than answers. Again, I'm talking in kind of a circular way here, because it's more or less just to introduce and review some of this thinking. I want to quickly go over just some, and these are just some of the books that are now available on the subject. And if you're building a library, this is Witnessed, True Story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO Abductions, a very real case that I worked with Bud. John Mack's book, Abduction. And I'm going to cut myself off right here. Those of you who studied this subject, there's a popular notion that Bud Hopkins was driven by an idea that these things were bad, and that John Mack was driven by an idea that they were good. Bud, again, pioneer researcher, the people that approached him, and this was at a time when this was not part of popular culture, overwhelmingly had not had positive experiences, nor positive reinforcement, very much needed validation and respect. And Bud simply dealt with the people that came to him with compassion and humanity. He certainly was a humanist and a very empathetic person. And whatever their plan, many people were not experiencing this positively. John Mack was driven in great part, and something we discussed a number of times, not that it was, private subject, he published around it. He took it very seriously that there was trauma involved for many people, but his interest, his passionate interest, which governed most of his writing and his philosophy on the subject, was in what can we learn from this that might have a positive implication for humanity. And that was his focus. Bud and John, who were very good friends and very close colleagues, agreed to disagree on a number of aspects of this. And why not? We're all feeling our way in the dark to one degree or another. Among the world of abduction literature, Connections, a very good book written by two women who were brought together when they were younger repeatedly by them and ultimately became a couple as adults. Also, the Experiencer books, Experiencer Raised in Two Worlds and Experiencer 2, When Worlds Collide. They're written by Bill Konkoletsky. Bill is the longtime head of Michigan MUFON. And one of the things I really admire about Bill and like about his books, he and his brother have had a lifetime of these experiences, positive and negative. And he just says it like it is. He doesn't hate them. He doesn't love them. He doesn't fear them. He doesn't, it's different on different times. Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind is a very scholarly book by C.B. Bryan. And Bryan is an investigative writer who attended the week-long conference at MIT, specifically on the alien abduction phenomena, that had ever so many lectures and research proposals presented by PhD level scholars. again at Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1992. Fascinating book. David Jacobs' books, and David is often associated with a negative aspect of this. The Threat, by the way, was a title that his publisher insisted on. And I think this is a far more important title, Secret Life, which is still how many people that have had these experiences deal with it. And David's simply recording the data of the people that approached him. And it's not a pretty picture. He sees this as part of a program leading to God knows what. The hybrid phenomena is covered quite well in Walking Among Us. Some of these beings seem to, they look so much not like us, or a hybrid of, where the other side is very prevalent. They are not public wherever they are. Some of them may even be institutionalized because they'd be so disturbing for us to see. Other ones look enough like us that they're out there. And I'll leave you to contemplate that. The University of Kansas, and you can imagine how rarely university presses take on the subject of UFOs, say UFO abductions, published a marvelous book called UFOs and Abductions, challenging the borders of knowledge. Almost all PhD scholars contributed to it, and a great piece of scholarship it is. Without consent from the UK, Carl Neglis and my dear old friend Philip Mantle published this in 1997. So we enter our question and answer phase here. As phased as I am, I still am trying to wrap my head around this subject as fully as I can. But one thing I am convinced of is that this is not a series of connected presenting signs for sleep paralysis combined with unusual psychological aberrations and the things that debunkers try to put forward. I know I've cut myself off several times and lost several threads. One of them, though, is the fact that I consider myself in a position where I no longer have the luxury of disbelief. For somebody that this hasn't happened to, I know I have to be particularly careful and self-critical in evaluating every new case. I can't simply assume that it's authentic because on the surface it seems to be so. And for me, that involves deductive reasoning, which is choosing the most mundane explanation, exploring it fully, and if nothing pans out, taking one step up to the second most mundane, boring, unsexy, unexotic postulates. And once you exhaust all of them, then things get interesting, because then you're kind of stuck with the non-standard. I want to thank you all for bearing with me in this wandering, kind of meandering presentation. I'll do my best to answer any questions, and even hearing myself say that, I have to laugh, because I know how little I know that I can absolutely put forward with certainty, but I'll do my best. The floor is open.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to let some people type in some questions. I do have a question for myself. Since you were such good friends with John Mack, I've always been wondering any sort of insight or any conversations that you had with him with his investigation of the school
Zimbabwe.
In Zimbabwe,
yeah.
with the school children and the teachers. Yes. Anything that you can tell us here from that? Also, the ecological message that the beings transmitted towards the children.
Yeah. Number one, I was aware of this case when it first became public because I was involved in the work. I never met Cynthia Hind. She was the best respected UFO investigator in Africa, and she was the first to investigate this case within the work. One of the things that struck us all was how solid these accounts were and how confident they were presented by all of the young people involved, as well as the peripherally involved adults. When John learned about it, he was truly fascinated. And I remember his first trip there, and he went with a good friend, Randy Nickerson, who is an abductee and had worked with both Bud and John, and a filmmaker. Randy became so involved in the case that he spent years, 13 years or something, making a documentary, which is now out there. And it's terrific. I'm forgetting the name offhand, but John was convinced that it was what it was. And the message that was given directly and indirectly to quite a number of these kids about concern for the environment is one that has been put forward repeatedly with countless abductees. And whether or not there's deception involved is always a possibility for their own purposes to manipulate us. At the same time, it sure makes good sense to try to wake humanity up. And this goes back decades before it was more trendy or more essential, and that it was, the subject was taken more seriously as it is now overall, even by people who were skeptical to start with and felt that it was all just naturally happening and that we human beings had nothing to do with it.
Like artwork, this is from Andy, I'm sorry. Like artwork, do you think perhaps the aliens, are admiring the work of our creator?
Gee, that's a great question. I have no idea. It's one that I could only give you the most subjective answer, which is just my own opinion, which is, again, I don't know. The beings themselves, are the reports of the abductees, these beings overall are incredibly methodical, almost mechanical in the procedures. I remember Helen, my sister, once describing her most memorable experiences like being in a well-run dentist's office. There was nothing romantic or ethereal about it. It was just, we're doing this. It used to be referred to as they're experimenting with us. I think that euphemism is long past any value. There's a program, in effect. What it's leading to, we can only make our best guesses about.
There have been some other questions in regards to the authors and books. Could you provide us, perhaps afterwards, with a list of all the books that you've, book titles, as well as the authors that you've listed today? And if you can remember that that documentary that the filmmaker who was with John Mack, the documentary that he made about the school children incident in Zimbabwe.
You can, I'm sure, get it in 2 Google hits, if not 1. The filmmaker's name is Randall Nickerson, and it's the documentary about the Zimbabwe school UFO event. It'll come right up. As far as I'm not in a situation at the moment where I can give you a reading list.
Yeah, just the books that you went over through. I just wanted to let everyone know that this recording will be uploaded on Halloween evening. So if you wanted to review it, you can go through all of the, the books that Peter has described, and shown during this tonight's presentation. I'm sure you'll be able to see all of their names, the titles, and the authors. And if you can, please try to, contact the Danbury Library and seeing if we can actually acquire those book titles for you through our interlibrary loan program. So I do know that we have Walk Among Us we have that here as part of our collection. As the other books, I think we might be able to acquire them to our interested patrons here.
Well, what I'll be glad to do, Aurelio, is when the dust settles of it and we have some time, I'll be glad to work with you on a reading list regarding this subject. Also, if you are on Facebook, you can friend me and contact me there. Believe it or not, there's more than one Peter Robbins in the universe. I'm the one near Ithaca, New York. Also, I do a weekly radio show. The station is KUNX. The program is called Meanwhile Here on Earth. It's been running for about 3 years, although earlier on another station. It's on Monday evenings, 7 to 9. You can audit it live by going to whatever their website is, KUNX Digital Broadcasting, and then those shows are archived as they are. But yeah, we can work on that.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So does anyone else have any other questions for Peter before we sign off for this evening? I just wanted to let you know that we do have an in-person conference event on Saturday, so please be sure to register for those two events on that day. If any of you are also interested in the abduction phenomena, we're having a screening of Close Encounters of the Third Kind tomorrow evening here at the Danbury Library in our Farioli room. So if you want to bring, family along and, sit through a very, very good piece of filmmaking by Steven Spielberg,
yeah,
I would suggest come on by and, we could all watch it together. We do have a couple of other questions
good.
before we sign off. Do abductees ever mention any other types of extraterrestrials besides the Greys?
Yes, great question. Again, no hard stats on this. I would say that maybe 80%, 70, 75, 80% of the cases and the descriptions that I'm familiar with personally in my work and work through Bud do fit that archetype of the gray. Large cranial structure, just a hint of a mouth and a nose, large, very dark eyes, kind of an emaciated little body, rarely more than 4 feet tall, although sometimes the other 20% or so very wildly. And that's where you get into descriptions of, reptoids and insect type beings and the ones that are sort of one-off. And that brings up another question of they do most definitely seem to have the power to affect our perceptions, our remembering, and our forgetting. Also, I think that they can appear differently to different people. And then there's a wild card of our mind and the physiology of shock. If I'm looking at something that I can't handle at all, my mind may shut down on a certain level and be kind to me, and I'm going to see something not quite like what I'm really seeing. One of the most prevalent aspects of that in research, wonderfully covered by colleague, friend, abductee and experiencer Mike Cleland, who's written several wonderful books. The image of the owl and how prevalent it is, but that there do seem to be cases where people perceive large owls that aren't large owls. It's just, what they either want us to see or what our mind is putting forward until we can deal with that memory, with some objectivity and without freaking the hell out.
One question from Marguerite. Do you have any thoughts on Jacques Vallée's research?
Overall, I have tremendous research for Jacques Vallée. I have respect for him. I first heard him speak in 1978 at the United Nations. I think he's one of our best minds. I do have some real issues with his most recent work around this alleged earlier than Roswell crash, I think from 1945 or so, the so-called Trinity crash, in a book that he co-authored. But overall, I hold his work in great esteem, much so, very much so.
And we got one more question from Joseph. How many extraterrestrial species have you heard of?
Extraterrestrial
Species, like the difference of like the grays, the Nordics, the insect,
yeah.
reptilian, that sort of.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I have no number. And some descriptions sort of fall between the lines of different ones. Again, we're dealing with a myriad, potentially, of other intelligences in different bodies from different other civilizations, from different, star systems, and the factoring in our seeing one thing and sort of smoothing it out for ourselves, or having them adjust our thinking on a certain level, or our perception. I don't have a number for that, but that's a great question. I'm sure there are folks in the work who have, categorized reports of different kind of alien beings by appearance. I'm not one of them.
And we have one bonus question. What are your thoughts about some of these experiences being consciousness change instead of physical abduction?
Say it again.
It is what are your thoughts about some of these experiences being a consciousness change instead of a physical abduction?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I neglected to say that there are many, many reports of people who have very positive experiences. My main focus has been, I care about people and folks who are having a difficult time of normalizing their experiences, rather than, gee, it was wonderful and changed my life, are the ones I'm more focused on than not. But it's another question that is somewhat subjective for me. I genuinely don't know. And I'd be wrong to, tell you something just because I don't want to, I'm supposed to be an authority on this, although I love that sometimes people refer to folks in the field as experts. I have to laugh whenever that's applied, or even authority. It's the ultimate existential oxymoron. You're an expert on the unknown? Okay. I wish I could do better on that last question.
No,
It's a
that's
good one.
okay. It's okay that we don't know. I mean, there's a lot, like what you said, there's a lot of stuff that, after so many years of all your research and investigations, we still don't know. And we still don't know a lot of what is going on. And that's why we're holding these annual conferences. Yes. It's just to try to, have a discussion to try to find out some answers, maybe just a little bit.
It is very exciting to be in a period of time, though, where our society is more open to the realities of truly anomalous UFOs and their implications for humanity. We're all aware of more and more news coverage, the interest within the American Congress, the House of Representatives, other world governments, that people, the ridicule factor is not nearly what it used to be. And every year it's a little less. That conditioning was brilliant and it worked wonderfully, starting when the beginning of the modern age of UFOs, that it's not anymore. It is no longer shorthand for, hi, I'm crazy, or I'm lonely, or I'm mentally ill, or I'm a con man, or I'm a lost soul. it can just mean what it means. I saw something I cannot identify or had an experience that was completely foreign to me, and I want to know more about it.
At that point, I leave that as a thought for the rest of the evening for you all. And thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you to Peter Robbins for sharing his time and his experiences and his knowledge to an extent of on his honesty and his worthwhile experience with other investigators during this UFO conference. And I thank you, Peter, for sharing your time with us.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you to all of you who have joined us tonight. And be sure to check out the rest of the UFO conference. And until then, good night.